Again, it is nice when I can see your faces, especially if you happen to be making kelaguen or something like that, then I definitely want to see you while you are making kelaguen. If you're making buñuelos, put favor, hold the batter up to your camera so that all of us can see it. And then please, I'll put my address in the comments, in the chat. Please, if you're making ahu, send me that ahu. I require ahu for all of these things that I do for free. All right, just kidding. All right, so here we go. I am so happy that Travis Savina, that that Halepadagupa is still doing stuff like this, still providing the resources, the opportunities, the networks that so many Chamorros in the islands and in the diaspora around the world are asking for, right? And so I'm so happy that they are the ones doing it, because for me, the resources, the knowledge that I have, anyone who is willing to help put the work to make it happen, then I'm willing to collaborate and help. But so this is the Tumu'i Haleta series. This comes courtesy of the Guam Museum. And so if you have not been to the Guam Museum, please do the next time you're on island. But the Guam Museum was closed for a year because of COVID. And now we are open on a limited basis. You can reserve a small tour to come into the museum because of the continuing COVID pandemic. But the pandemic, when I came on 6 months ago, though, one of the things that I really wanted to do was create more virtual distance opportunities, especially to sort of expand the museum from being something that, that people on Guam physically can only enjoy, but use the resources, use it as a platform to engage the larger community that is connected to Guam, Chamorros in the diaspora, people with roots in Guam in the diaspora who aren't Chamorro, but others who are interested in learning more about the wonderful history of the Chamorro people and the wonderful islands that they come from. And so this is part of that. I'm grateful for Halepadagupa to create this opportunity for us to pilot some certain things, right? So if you want more stuff like this, then be sure to let Halepadagupa know, be sure to let me know, because one of the things that I would like to do is create more a membership possibilities for people off island so that they can still access museum resources and so on. And so I've been talking to my bosses and the foundation of the museum about things like that. And so the more interest there is, then the more likelihood that I can make stuff like that happen. Right. And so this is our schedule over the next 8 weeks. And so whenever I do something like this, I do not like to let people know ahead of time what I'm going to cover, because you shouldn't get to pick and choose. If you want to know what they are, then you got to show up. And so every week is something different from the museum, from our collection, from our exhibits, and so on. And so by looking at this, you can get a sense, because each of these images is a clue as to what each week might cover. Right. And so you can see here, some of you may have some guesses. If you want to throw out some guesses, some of you may recognize some of these things. If you look at this one, you can probably guess what that is. This is what's it called? This is from that movie, Finding Nemo, right? This is a famous statue, not on Guam, somewhere else in the world. If you're super Catholic, then you might recognize this. If you're from Santa Rita, then you may know a little bit about this person. This one's fun. This one's fun. And then the last two here. So anyways, each of these is an image, is a clue as to what we might cover. All right, but so each of these items, though, comes from the museum, is involved, is somewhere here. And so each of these lectures won't necessarily focus only on the item, but it'll also focus on the history around the item, some of the culture involved with it, and other dynamics. So we start with the item, and then we broaden our scope out from there. All right. And so here we go. If you were paying attention a moment ago, I accidentally clicked ahead and you could see what it was. But Hatsa, our first lecture, focuses on this item right here. And so if you are familiar with this, this is called a Poyu, or it is called Aatsu Atsuman. And this is a really cool item that we have here in the museum. This is a very cool item. And so this is, as we're going to learn about today, this is a device which ancient Chamorros used to fish. Okay, now from this image here, this piece right here towards the front is an artifact. This was found as part of an excavation on Guam. In the back, this is a replica, sort of a recreation of what it would have looked like based on artifacts, but also historical drawings. And so the Poyu, something very cool. It is something that ancient Chamorros used to catch fish that normally swam far beneath their ability to catch, right? Fish that swim, that gather deep underwater. This was a device that ancient Chamorros used to train the fish to make them more easy, to make them more easily caught. And so before we get into the Poyu specifically though, let's talk about ancient Chamorro fishing practices. And so this is a Ron Castro painting that we have here in the museum. It is an updated version of a drawing from the Freyjuan expedition, which came to Guam in 1819. And you will hear me talk a little bit about the Freyjuan expedition in this lecture and in other lectures, because it was compared to other visits to the Marianas. It lasted for several months. It involved talking to Chamorros, interviewing them, looking at a lot of artifacts and documents. And so it gives us a more complete picture compared to accounts that we have from people who just stopped in Guam for a few days. And so you'll note here, this figure right here is holding the Poyu, or the Aatsu Atsuman. This person right here who totally makes me feel like I am not using my Paradise Fitness gym membership effectively. Look, anyways, I don't know about all of you, but I have definitely put on some pandemic pounds. And this is making me, yes, this is making me want to go to the gym. But this image features a lot of different fishing techniques, some of which we're going to talk about today. All right. But first, let's go to Freyjuan Pobre in 1602. And if you haven't read the Freyjuan Pobre account, I highly encourage you to do so, because Freyjuan Pobre's account is one of the most complete sort of portraits of ancient Chamorro life prior to colonization. Freyjuan Pobre was a lay brother who lived in the island of Rota for several months, and he found a Spaniard named Sancho who could speak Chamorro, who had married into the culture after being shipwrecked in Saipan earlier. And so through that, he wrote a very complete account in which he spoke very highly of Chamorro culture at that time and provided a very in-depth portrait compared to other accounts from that time. And so Freyjuan Pobre was a huge fan of Chamorros and their fishing ability. And so he says that as far as their fishing skills and devices are concerned, it would take a very long story to tell about them. Consequently, I will only say that they use the same kinds of nets and fishing tricks that our people use, and many more. When it comes to fishing from their boats, no better seamen or divers have ever been known to exist. Let's talk about some of those different types of fishing. Now, remember that ancient Chamorro fishing, they didn't have metal. They didn't use rods and reels like you might use nowadays. They didn't have synthetic nets. They used stone, they used shell, they used rope made from tree fibers, they used wood, but they still developed an array of styles and techniques which made them very effective at catching sort of fish, at catching fish. And so different Spanish visitors from that time always remarked Chamorros were excellent fishers. And so here are a few. Now, one thing that I should note, though, before I continue, though, is that some of these types of fishing will be called different things by different families on different islands and in different villages, right? So, for example, etupak, which is pole and line fishing, which nowadays might be rod and reel fishing, but in the past was just a pole with the line and a hook on it. Some people will pronounce it edupak, edupat. They will pronounce it in different ways. Okay, sulu, night fishing by torchlight. This is a form of fishing that you used to do with a torch, like a bamboo torch. And then nowadays, people who do that use a flashlight, right? But you have a fiska or a fishing spear. So lagua is a generic term for net. And so Chamorros used all different types of nets when they were fishing, smaller ones, big ones. Nowadays, we use the word taladza to refer to net, but that's only a particular type of net. And we're going to get into that a little bit later. Lalagu is fishing with your hands. And so accounts say that this was a preferred type of fishing amongst Chamorro women, because women controlled, at least some accounts say that women were the masters of the water within the reef, that men were the masters of water outside the reef, but sort of the shallow waters within the reef, that was where women had domain over them. And so even up until the early 20th century, Chamorro women were still fishing with their hands. And so they would go out into the rocks, reach in, grab the fish, tickle the fish. I do not know if you can tickle a fish, but the accounts say that that's exactly what they would do. And then they would pull them out. Now, just a warning of caution for those of you who want to go Antigua and try to fish with your hands, be very careful. You don't grab on to an eel. Be very careful that you don't try to tickle a sea urchin. Okay, so please be careful if you're trying to do that. And don't say that Bevacqua told you to. You know, when you end up at Guam Memorial Hospital because you tried to sort of you tried to harass a sea urchin, a poor sea urchin that was just minding its own business. Don't blame Bevacqua. All right, gigaos. Gigao is in the past they were primarily stones, but by the 20th century, the last gigaos that Chamorros were made with wood and often used like wire mesh. And so these could be areas that you would block off to make fish easier to catch. They also included false sanctuaries, false refuges. So you would pile up stones within the reef that would look very inviting for a fish that was trying to get away. And then you would design it, though, that it only had one entrance and one exit. And so after it had been there for a while, you would go back and block the exit and then take the stones off the top, and all of your fish would be there waiting for you. Actually, Chamorros were so good at fishing that when I describe how effective they were, it almost sounds like they were like serial killers because they were really good. The fish didn't really have a chance. I feel so bad. Finally, sensulu fishing, surround net. You could have a net which was 200 feet long, right? A huge net in which an entire village might come together to help catch those fish. And in fact, and then finally teken or gill net, a net which is placed sort of at an area where fish will be passing by, and then you have people who drive the fish into that area. Now, there are other types of fishing in addition to these, but this can give you a sense of some of the types. And many of these are still practiced today, although with changes in technology, changes of technique. One of the things that early Europeans in the Marianas marveled at is that Chamorros were masters of and were regularly catching deep sea fish. This was, now around the world, people caught deep sea fish, but it was not necessarily something which you would commonly do because it was dangerous and because it was oftentimes low yield at that time. And so, but ancient Chamorros regularly caught things such as sailfish, marlins, big-eyed jacks, mahi mahi, that the Spanish observed that Chamorros were regularly catching these sorts of things. And that was amazing to them because the Spanish considered Chamorros to be technologically beneath them. They were fishing for these things without metal, without the types of nets, without the boats that the Spanish had. And so this was pretty amazing to them. And so this is out of all of the Chamorro fishing stories that I know, the story of Sunyama is probably my favorite. And so this was a story that was recounted to Freyjuan Pobre by Sancho, his Spaniard friend, who was his main informant in his account. And so Sunyama was a great warrior. He was considered to be one of the most esteemed people, according to the account on the island of Rota. And he excelled at fishing. And so one day he went out alone in a canoe. He caught 2 flying fish. He ate 1 fish, and then with the second fish, he used that as bait, and he caught a big billfish, a blue marlin perhaps. And using just a rope, the hook, and his canoe, he started to wear down the marlin. If any of you have ever gone fishing like that, right? It's not just like you pull them out of the water. Those fish sometimes are larger than you. Sometimes they're larger than your boat. Right? And so he tired the fish out, but while he was doing that, a shark came along. And this is not one of those sharks that believes that fish are friends. This shark started to grab on to the marlin. Now, I don't know what you would do in that sort of situation. For me, I would tell the shark, Hafa de, buenas, hungan, suliha, go ahead and take that. We're good. Please don't reenact a scene from Jaws or Deep Blue Sea here and eat me, put favor, right? Sunyama did not do that. Sunyama looked at that shark and said, tisinya munga hao tsapmo hit. And he jumped into the water, and then he got the shark's attention, and then he messed around with the shark, right? Gave it another target, but dodged the shark, right? Frustrated the shark. Somebody once told me that, sharks give up easily. If it's too hard to eat something or catch something, then they'll give up. So if a shark is ever going after you, just dodge long enough, make yourself difficult to catch, and then the shark might just give up. So Sunyama was able to distract and frustrate the shark enough so that the shark just left him and swam away. Then he grabbed his marlin back, attached it to his boat, which had capsized, by the way, in the midst of all this. And then he sailed back home. And as was the tradition at that time, when you went from fishing out in the open water, you had different sails that you would raise depending on if you had been successful or not in catching things. And so he raised a particular woven mat to indicate that he had been successful. And the people on shore blew their kulu and praised him and eagerly waited for him to come back. Sancho, the Spaniard who told this story to Freyjuan Pobre, said, Chamorros were the most skilled fishermen to have ever been discovered. And so the Aatsu Atsuman, or the Poyu, is one of those techniques that we can see, where we can see sort of their skill in the water. And so this is, as I said, this is a recreation. This piece is in the Guam Museum. I showed you a short video of it earlier. It is in our gallery, Itasi Zanitano, the sea and the land. And so the way that the Aatsu Atsuman works is that the type of fish that they would that they would catch with this, according to accounts, are primarily a jack which swims normally deep underwater. And so what you would do is that the bottom half is the sinker, the top half is a coconut shell, haiguas nizuk, right? And there are holes that are drilled into the coconut shell. And then you fasten that on, and then you put coconut meat. And so one account says that Chamorros would chew it while they were on the boat, and then they would even put their mouth up to the hole and spit it in underneath the coconut shell. And then once it was filled up, you would sail out. And one description says that for this, this is deep sea fishing. So it's out beyond the reef, at least a mile offshore, but up until 10 miles offshore. And what you do is you look for areas in which there will be those schools of fish, those jacks, which you cannot catch normally, right? Because a fish that swims 100 feet under the water, how are you going to get that? Even your cousin who swears that he could hold his breath for 10 minutes because he's got a TikTok channel where he says that, he can't do that. He would struggle to catch those types of fish for sure, right? But what you do then is you don't go after them, but you design a mechanism in which it's easier for them to come to you. And so you lower the Poyu down into the water. And with the long rope, this palgu, talin palgu, this hibiscus fiber rope, you mark the depth at which you have dropped it. Let's say 100 feet. And then once it's in there, you start to chum. You shake it so that the coconut meat comes out into the water and it creates a cloud. Now, I really enjoy coconut meat, right? But then again, I live on an island where I could get coconut meat pretty easily, right? But how often does a fish that swims like 100 feet underwater, how often do they get to eat coconut meat, right? I imagine that coconut meat to them is like Kobe beef for me, or that Wagyu beef or something like that, right? Because for them, and this is something that ancient Chamorros did, they didn't like put worms on hooks. They knew that for these types of fish, coconut meat would be a great lure, a great draw. And so they would create a cloud of coconut meat in the water. And I mean, imagine those fish. You're in this big school of jacks, right? And you're swimming along. You're wondering, where are we headed to? You have these questions about your life. You know, you're wondering why you're still in school after all this time. That's a dad joke. That's a pun, right? Schools of fish. That's right. My daughter is not here to hear it. She is groaning from JFK High School, where she is currently in class right now. That dad joke was so strong, she could feel it from Hagatnya to Tumuning. She could feel it. And so imagine those fish looking up. Oh my goodness, that's, of course, they're going to gather. They're going to swarm. They're going to be super excited. And fish have memories for those sorts of things, right? And Chamorros take advantage of that. So after it's been in the water for a while, you pull up the Poyu and then you go home. And then the next day, you come back to the exact same spot around the same time of day, and then you fill the Poyu up with coconut meat and you drop it down again. But this time you have to drop it 5 to 10 feet less, because the fish will not swim 100 feet up to get to the coconut meat, but they will definitely swim 5 to 10 feet up from their normal range. Put it in the water again. The fish are like, oh my goodness, it's tax refund day again. Oh my goodness. Then you pull it up, you go home, come back. The next day, 5, 10 feet less, the fish are like, we've just won the Nidzuk lottery. We have won the coconut lottery again. And now the accounts say that you could do this for 2 weeks. And then for some schools of fish, you might do this over 60 days, right? So 2 months. But each time slowly decreasing the depth until these fish, which normally swim far out of your reach, are 6 feet, less than 10 feet, about 6 feet to the surface. And then the Chamorros would use a large net called Aatsu Atsuman. And Atsuman is the word that they used for the type of scad that they love to catch with this. And then all of these fish that used to be sort of a distant dream, suddenly you're just pulling them out of the water real easily. Now, in the 19th century, Chamorros still had knowledge of this, but on Guam, it was said that they no longer actively practiced it. So when the Freycinet expedition came to Guam, this is a drawing from the Freycinet expedition, the Chamorros knew about the Poyu, or the Aatsu Atsuman, and they still had stories about it. And in fact, one Spanish governor in the middle of the 1800s said that Chamorros still loved to talk about this fishing technique that they used to do, because according to them, you could catch a ton of fish in one day. After all that work, on the day that you finally went in to catch the fish, you could catch more than a ton of them. But they said that in Guam, Chamorros no longer use this technique anymore. Now, in the 20th century, though, this technique is said to have survived in the island of Rota. And there is at least one family in Rota which continues to use this technique. Although they have modified it in certain ways, they don't use the exact same sort of device. And it's also my understanding too that they have, in the past few years, they've even done some workshops with youth to try to teach them sort of how to do this style. But I don't want to necessarily share the family because I know that sometimes they have been secretive about sort of the knowledge and about not wanting to, worried that more people will come and use their techniques in their preferred fishing spots as well. But so it is interesting because in some ways, things that disappeared in Guam, we sometimes find them in the northern islands where colonization was not as impactful, where sort of modernization and Americanization didn't hit as hard either, at least not yet. And so it is nice to see that this tradition, it persists in the island of Luta. Now, thinking about sort of Chamorro fishing more broadly, though, one of the things that is often pointed to is Greg Dueñas Perez, Familia Godzu, who was the world record holder for a blue marlin catch in 1969. And so one of the first times that Guam was written about in a international tourism magazine in 1973, it mentions Greg Perez, who in 1969 caught a marlin off the coast of northern Guam, which weighed more than 1,100 pounds and was 15 feet long. And so on the right here, we have a PDN article from the early 90s, which recounts, in which sort of Tun Gregorio, he recounts the day in which he made that catch. And so people often point to this as being sort of an example of the continuity with the past, right? So the great Chamorro fishers of the past, and that these traditions, the skills still persist. They still continue in the culture up until today. And they often point to Tun Gregorio as an example of that. And so from the Perez family, we do have this picture up in the gallery for Itasid Zanitano. And so Joe Murphy, who used to be the editor and the publisher for the Pacific Daily News, he wrote in the PDN in 72 a joke. Somebody was telling me that Greg Perez caught a marlin so big there wasn't any scale on island big enough to weigh it. However, they did take a picture of the monster and the photo weighed 12 pounds. Ha ha. Natsulik. That's good. Zahuano, I'm going to use that. And so talking about continuity is important, right? Because one of the things that the museum does is the museum tells stories, but it doesn't, even if items in a museum are in a box, we don't tell the stories in a box. We don't show you something so you can say, oh, it's nice that in the past that existed necessarily. One of the great things that a museum can do is draw the connections up until today, right? And so, again, and so it is nice to sort of see that, so fishing still is an important part of Chamorro culture up until today. Although we do see some changes, though. We do see, now, just before I forget, Tun Gregorio, he held the record for, I believe, 12 or 13 years until it was broken. And then recently, his family, which created a foundation in his honor, they started a fishing derby, in which sort of they paid tribute to his skill as a fisher and so on. Oh, wait, no, sorry. Okay. All right. Now, one of the things we should note, though, is that today, out of all of the fishing that I talked, all of the fishing that we've talked about today, the most iconic one that is representative of Chamorro culture today is the taladza. Now, it's very likely that Chamorros had something similar to the taladza in ancient times, although the taladza itself, as we know it today, is something that came in during the Spanish period. The word taladza comes from Spanish. And so this is, but you still see taladzeros, you still see fishers who use the taladza walking around the island, right? Sort of still fishing in a more traditional way, right? And so I want to tell you a story about a taladzero, because when we are learning about these sorts of things, it's not simply the objects themselves, but it is also the values and the worldview which may have created those objects, or which the Chamorro worldview, the Chamorro cultural values in which those objects may have been born from. And so some of you who have taken my some of you who are taking my Zoom classes, you may have heard this story because I shared it once in my Zoom Chamorro classes. And so this is an image of a family sort of weaving their nets, weaving a taladza net, fixing it up, right? That the older relatives are passing on the knowledge to the younger generation. And so I was told this story by an older taladzero while he was sitting with my father. We were at the Micronesian Island Fair at Ipao Beach one year. And so my grandfather was a cultural master for blacksmithing, and this taladzero was a cultural master for fishing. And so the story goes like this. There was a young boy in a village who wanted to be the best taladzero. He wanted to be the best, better than everyone else, right? A taladzero is the skill of a taladzero is determined by how much they can catch in one throw, right? Because you watch the fish as they are out moving around, and then you throw it, and then the true prowess of a taladzero is in one go how many they could get, right? And so this young boy said that he wanted to be the best. I know it sounds like Pokemon. Want to be the best there ever was. And so he went to Estinasaina, this bihu, this old man who was sort of known as the best taladzero in the village, and he went up to him and he said, "Teach me how to be the best taladzero. I want to be the best. I'm going to be the best," right? Sort of brimming with hubris, brimming with pride. And in Chamorro stories back in the day, anybody who sounds like that, something bad's gonna happen to them, or they're gonna be made to look like a fool for sure, because that's taimamala. It's without shame. And so the old man looked at the boy and then said, "Hungan, yes, I will. The first thing, though, is that you need to weave a basket." And the young boy said, "I don't need to weave a basket. Didn't you hear me? I don't want to be the best weaver. I want to be the best taladzero, and you're going to teach me how, So I need a net. Get me a net." And the old man said, Hungan, I know. The first step to becoming a taladzero is to get some of those coconut leaves, and you need to make a basket." And the young boy, refusing to believe this old man, wondering perhaps if he had litiko bodig, right? Or if he had something, if he was going demented and he wasn't understanding him, he kept pressing. And he said, "Don't grab, I'm going to take this net. We're going to go right now and you're going to teach me." And the old man, feeling frustrated though, said, "Fine, let's go." And so they went down to the beach, and the young boy sort of got the taladza. And I don't know how many of you have ever thrown a taladza net before, but it can be hard. The first time that I threw a taladza net, the only thing that I caught was myself. Because if you're not careful with how you throw it, you'll get the boomerang. You don't want to boomerang the taladza. That's mixing cultural metaphors. And so the young boy, the old man told him, Here's how you throw it. The young boy looked for a school of fish and then he threw it out, a nice throw, hit the fish. And then the boy got them and he was so excited. And the old man looked at him and said, yes, but what are you going to do with your fish? Because taladzero back in the day, you would have to have a guagua. You would have to have a basket with you so that all the fish that you caught, you could make sure to put them in there so that you could take them with you. So you wouldn't have to go to the beach every time you caught something, so that you wouldn't have to go home every time you caught something. And so the old man said, if you want to be a taladzero, you first have to weave a basket. And so he said, here, you can use mine. And so I bring this up though, because over the course of this series, when we are talking about these artifacts, we are talking about culture, I don't want you to think of them as bounded necessarily by time. They may come from historical eras. They may be artifacts, right? And they may have a stamp of time on them, right? Or that they belong to the life of a Chamorro from a particular era. But what we need to remember though is, what are the elements which provide continuity to our lives today? So what is the wisdom or the intelligence from these sorts of things that we can draw from today? And for me personally, I always want to highlight, whenever talking about culture, highlight the cultural masters of the past. All right, and so the Guam Council on the Arts and Humanities Agency has recognized a number of cultural masters, several dozen of them. If you live on Guam, you can see that around the island, there are posters in different government offices, sometimes in businesses, which will feature pictures of the masters and short biographies. If you're fortunate enough, then you have a copy of this book, which gathered the majority of the posters and the biographies together. A Journey with the Masters of Chamorro Tradition, published by the Guam Council on the Arts and Humanities. And so these are the masters of fishing. And so we have here on the left, we have the late Joaquin Guerrero and his son Anthony Guerrero for taladza fishing. We have down here Jose and Makalada Ugan, which for Manyahak, Taladzero and Manyahak, again taladza fishing. Vicente Salas Sablan from the island of Saipan, again for the taladza, and Jose Pansalan for the taladza. And so now, one thing that I want to draw your attention to is there are literally dozens of different types of Chamorro fishing. We went through several of them at the beginning. But if you look at the masters of Chamorro culture, only taladzeros have ever been recognized. There has never been another type of fishing that has been recognized, or a fisher who did that type of fishing. Despite the fact that Chamorros still do a lot of other types of fishing. There's still, and so I want to draw that attention to that, because this is part of the change in the culture that we can see, is that fishing, this is an image of Tsensulu fishing. If I remember correctly, it is in the village of Inalahan after World War II. And so Tsensulu fishing was the most emblematic of communal fishing in the past, because Tsensulu fishing, oftentimes it involved dozens of people. So when you did the Tsensulu fishing, you might have a massive net, and you would need dozens of people to drive fish, to pull the net, to lift the net, to catch the fish, to count the fish. And so they say it takes a village. It took a village for certain types of Tsensulu fishing. And many of the types of fishing before were something in which it was a communal, a collective sort of effort. But one thing from the taladzeru sort of experience though, and we can see the changes in the culture, is that the taladzeru is largely alone. when we think about the taledzero, we think about one person on the beach, watching the fish, catching the fish. Even if they may fish in groups sometimes, I mean, part of it is you know, if multiple taledzeros on the same beach, you want to give each other some space because you don't want to hit each other with your nets. You don't want to you don't want to scare off fish from each other. But this is part of the cultural change that we are experiencing, is that even if many of these fishing traditions have been adapted and they still exist in some ways, part of the larger way of life that Chamorros that we exist in today has shifted to the point where feeding and sustaining the family is something, feeding and sustaining a family, a village, was something that most everybody participated in, to now where less and less people fish, and you tend to fish alone or in very small groups. You don't tend to fish in large groups. It's not something that an entire family necessarily does, although there are some families that do live like that still. But fish that is caught tends to be caught by a smaller and smaller number of individuals, just like for farming on Guam as well. And so thinking about this, about how there is continuity, how we adapt, but at the same time, how there are these forces which shift and put pressures and then push the culture in different directions, right? And so the Poyu, the Aatsu Atsuman, comes from a very strong connection to the world around us, a deep understanding of how fish think, how fish move. And so we have to wonder today, sort of, how have we become disconnected, especially for those of us that live in the islands? And remember that all of us may know one person who lives in a very traditional, very rooted way, but the majority of people don't necessarily live that way. It's interesting because, but what does that mean then? Taking the example of fishing, sort of, you can connect this to the fact that so many things are imported into our islands today, and that's how we largely feed ourselves. 90% of what we eat comes from off island in Guam. And if you think about that, you think then that we get most of it from off island, we get it in stores, we can't feed ourselves, but that's fueled by this disconnect where fewer and fewer people are connected to the rhythms of the land. And more people simply go to a store. And I do not say this to call anybody out, because I live that life. I would love it if I had land where I could plant things. I don't have land. I would love it if I had the time where I could fish, but the only fishing I do is McDonald's has the 2 for $6 on island for the fish fillet. So you can get like 2 fish fillets for $6, mix in a Big Mac if you want. And so I don't speak of this because I want to like culture shame people, because we should never do that, because that's not necessarily how you improve things, right? Because a lot of times people will talk about, you know, living a real way, but they don't necessarily live that way, right? But we want to look at what is it that is a value of our past? What is the ingenuity? What is the innovation? What is the mindset? What is the knowledge? How can we transform it so that it's around for us today? And so I want to share one final thing. If you are not familiar with Nihi Kids, you should definitely subscribe to them on YouTube. They do accept donations, like a monthly donation. So every month I give a monthly donation to them that you can set up via PayPal. But they produce great content. And so this is a poem and a video that they created around fishing called Pescadotsu.
Guahu si Shayana Alvarez. My name is Shayana Alvarez, and this is my dad.
Ready to go, John?
This is a typical Saturday. My dad wakes me up before the sun rises, and we prepare for a day on the water. I love Saturdays because I get to spend time in the ocean and with my dad. Just like our ancestors, we fish with our family and friends. Everyone does their part. Fishing is a part of my culture and has been passed down from generation to generation.
Guys, we're gonna leave in about 5 minutes, man. Heading out. We'll head down there. Go ahead.
My dad teaches me to take care of the ocean, to pick up my trash, and to share with others. This is our tradition. I can't explain to you how much I love the ocean. I know that when I am in the water, I feel at peace and I'm happy. Guahu si Sheana Avers, Pescador Zut.
Mihi is made possible.
Agupa. And there you can see nihikids.org. They have a lot of great videos. So if you don't already follow them, please do. And so this has been the first lecture in this Tumu'i Haleta series. And so we have unlocked the first on our Chamorro Cultural Advent calendar here. We have unlocked the first lecture. And so it was the Poyu, the Aatsu Atsuman. Next week, we will be talking about Finding Nemo. No, I'm just kidding. But the image there is a clue as to what we will be talking about. And so remember that for each of these, we're talking not just about the object itself, but the larger culture around the object. And so one thing to always remember is that when the Spanish came in, they highlighted certain things. But then they highlighted certain things such as our fishing, such as our navigation, the canoes. But over the time of colonization, Chamorros started to feel that our culture was not as important or not as valuable. The cultural renaissance that has been happening for several decades has done a lot to help us re-embrace sort of our roots. And so, but we always need to remember as part of that, what is it from the past? What is it from the past that we want to bring to life in our lives today? Is it simply sort of that we want to wear shell jewelry, right? Or is it that we want to go and fish with stone sinkers and a coconut? You can, I want to see somebody do it. Or is it that what we want to revive is the ingenuity, the innovation and the creativity of the past? Because we often think about ingenuity and creativity in a very modern sense, right? So we think about it as being disconnected from the world, and it takes us away from the world, away from the present. But when we think about ingenuity and creativity in an indigenous sense, it connects you to your resources. It doesn't take you away from them. It's not that equation where your resources have to be destroyed for you to progress, where you have to damage and throw things away. Indigenous ingenuity and innovation is all about connecting and sustaining. And so that's one of the methods, that's one of the things that we can remember and that we should take with us. And we think about Chamorro fishing from the past up until today is not necessarily that we need to go and fish and catch a marlin with hibiscus rope and a shell hook, although you will win the Chamorro Olympics. Fauna and Punten will give you your gold medal. That's not going to be gold. It's going to be made out of turtle shell. Your turtle shell medal, because you will have won if you do that nowadays. But yes, so that is sort of the end of this first lecture. Thank you everyone for tuning in, for joining. I know that there's some questions. If you want to stick around, I can take like maybe 5. Hey, half a day. I can take like a few minutes to try to answer some of your questions. That's true. We absolutely should have Chamorro games. In fact, I just want to make Chamorro games. I don't even care if anyone buys them. I just want to do it because, and sometimes my kids are like, "Lo hadzi malago fumahan no," but who wants to buy that? And I'm like, "Para kitsu no, I don't care about that. I want to see it in the world." Yes, if I was Elon Musk, then I could make it and have 1 billion of them in the world, but I'm not. So let's make it and we'll have 1 in the world, or 10. Okay, so let's see what's okay. Paula says there is a big disconnect in what we were taught in school, but that's true. So one thing I always want to highlight for everybody is that traditionally education happened right within the family, within the village, right? But nowadays we think of education primarily happening in schools. You spend all your time in school learning what's important, right? So what you gather from your family is actually significantly less. You may say like, "Oh, my dad taught me everything I know," but in truth, you spent more time in a concrete building with people who you might have some connection to, but actually your teachers spent way more time with you than your family did during that time in terms of active engagement, active communication. So one thing that we need to remember is, how is it that we can pass on skills and values? And one way is that you can bring them into the school system, but another way is that we can try to reimagine our family dynamics too, right? And so, and part of it is we have to deal with it. And I know some of you mentioned this in the comments. We have to deal with the fact that some of our elders lived lives that they felt were really hard and difficult, and they saw that you don't want to pass those things on to your kids or your grandkids, because why should they have to work in a farm, right? Better that they work in an office. They can make more money, and then they don't gotta sweat all day like we did. And so there's that big disconnect, right? Because in truth, having that foundation where you understand the land, its rhythms, where you understand that type of work, that would be important even if you did end up working in an office. And so that's what we have to remember, is that the knowledge and the wisdom of our ancestors, there was this disconnect where it didn't get passed on. So we need to find ways to pass it on. Because, and I am an aircon baby. Some of you may be aircon babies. If you live on Guam, then we are humans too. You know, and so how is it that we can, but part of that is the fact that when I was growing up, you know, we had a ranch, but I didn't have to work on the ranch. I wasn't shown anything on the ranch. And so when yeah, so that's one of those things. How is it that how can we get the next generation to understand that rootedness? It doesn't mean you lock them in that life, but it's better if you have that appreciation. It's always better. It's always better. And so these practices, so these fishing practices, as I mentioned, a lot of them people can't incorporate into their lives, right? Because when you think about, isn't it, this is what's always amazing about human existence, right? Is that the more we create things which do things faster to give us more time, the less we feel like we have time for things. Isn't that insane? Maybe we're not, maybe we're not heading for Star Trek, like where everything's perfect and awesome. Maybe we're heading for everybody having anxiety disorders because of social media and stuff like that. But so part of it is the fact that the world has developed certain late capitalist modern economic ways, right? And so it is hard to sustain. But I always point to, and if you've taken any of my history classes before, I always point to Chamorros in the 1930s as having a really good model. Because the Chamorro economic model in the 1930s was that the US Navy was spending more on the island than the Spanish did. But did that mean that every Chamorro wanted to work for you would have some of them work for the Navy as teachers, as agricultural assistants, and you would have some who would farm. So you would split the labor. So one or two of your kids would become teachers, and that would give income to the family. And then your other kids would work on the farm. And that some families would map this out. And it was oftentimes women, because they were the ones that controlled the money for the most part, that they would kind of determine and say, well, yes, you know, so-and-so should work as a teacher because that can give us some money. So a very practical idea, right, is that because the US Navy at that time told Chamorros, stop growing food to feed yourself. And the Chamorro response was, you're crazy. Why would we do that? If we can feed ourselves, we want to feed ourselves. We shouldn't stop feeding ourselves, but we also recognize that there's value in what you're offering. So we also want to have some money. But we're not going to disconnect ourselves from the land so that we buy everything in a store. It's better that we find a balance. And it is still possible to live like that nowadays. It's much more difficult. In the 30s, it was really easy. But so when we talk about how to balance these things out, there's ways that you can do it, but it means then that the family and that a village has to kind of organize itself better than just everybody trying to get as much as they can. Because that's sort of the model now, right? Is that, you know, as an individual, you want this, you want to get this, but if you think about it more as a family, some people move in this direction, others do this. So there's ways that we can bring a lot of these practices back, integrate them into our lives, but it does require that families see themselves as more than just individuals who sometimes hang out together, right? And get together for funerals or share a family chat, which is filled with rosary gifts, right? And so, but yes, so that's what I always tell people is that, like, if you have, you know, let's say, for example, you have family land back home, don't sell it. How can you organize your family so that some of you can work that land to provide, and that maybe the rest of you can support their efforts? And then in exchange, they grow things and produce things which then are used for family parties, which can be sold at markets, can be shared as tsensuli. But you just have to plan and manage, and you have to support. Because if one person goes on their own to try to farm, it's difficult. But if the family kind of gets together and says, this is Tata's land, farming was the most important thing to him, we got to keep that part of our culture, our family alive. Let's organize this. Oh, then everything can kind of, then everything shifts. And so somebody is asking, so back before the war, yes, it was traditional that the majority of the fish was distributed. It wasn't sold, but nowadays it's much more common that some of it is distributed and more of it is sold because of how important money is to sort of surviving nowadays. But yes, so that shows the influence of money, the necessity of money. But before, like it was more about sensuli. The fish was more about exchanging and trading. Again, and so I see that some of you are asking. And so we don't actually know what type of net the women would have woven to catch the giant fish. And so it would have, I mean, if it's, because the problem is that the largest nets, you don't throw them like a taladza net. But so that's why I say the taladza that we have nowadays, it comes from a particular tradition, but it's very likely that Chamorros did have throw nets, but they just weren't called taladza. So there's, what is it? Laguanzotti. Laguanzotti is a term which exists, Freyjuan wrote down, and laguanzotti is a net that you throw. And so, but the taladza net itself is not it. So that could have been the name for it. And so, oh, I see people who are connected to Greg Perez. Yes, yes. It's true, it's true. And so, but the thing that we always have to balance out, right, is that because for some people who fish nowadays, they don't necessarily fish in sustainable ways because it's traditional life connected to a sort of exploitative economic model. So you just try to catch as much as you can, not thinking about sustaining it, right? So that's why this is part of the problem with this type of, with developing more sustainable models, is that if you only have it in part of the system, then it doesn't work. It has to be part of a broader approach of integrating things. But yes, no, thank you so thank you so much for all your questions. And so what I'm going to try to do is that we could have like a, so because I may not get to your questions as I'm presenting, but I liked this a lot. And in fact, I'm going to save the chat so that for some of you, I can maybe before next lecture, I can answer some of your questions while we're waiting to start. There we go, I saved the chat. But yes, Sidus Masinu Hamzu Todus, Halepadagupa, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun.
We appreciate that and hope everybody enjoyed it. Can't wait to see what you have for us next week. If anyone does have any other questions, definitely let us know. Otherwise, we will see you all esta semana. Adios.